It's 1993. You're leading an expedition into the Khamar-Daban Mountains, tracing the steps of 7 hikers who should have returned home. The trail looks normal until you reach their campsite. The air is still, there's no signs of a struggle, but then you see them, the 6 lifeless people sprawled across the ground. No wounds, no signs of an attack, but their faces frozen in terror. Their mouths foaming, their eyes bleeding, and only one person survived to tell the story. What happened here? And more importantly, could it happen again? If this were a simple accident, well, we wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be listening. But the Khamar-Daban Incident remains one of Russia's most terrifying, unexplained wilderness mysteries. These hikers were young, experienced and healthy. They had food, gear, and knowledge, yet something took them down in a way that defied everything we understand about survival. And the sole survivor, Valentina Utochenko, even she couldn't explain what she saw that day. It would be easy to dismiss this as an isolated event, but it wasn't the first time something like this happened in the Russian wilderness. Strange deaths, unexplained panic, and bodies left in conditions that make no sense. Today, we follow the path of the Korovina Group, their final moments and their descent into horror, and all of the chilling possibilities as to what may have caused it. Because history has shown one thing: when people enter these mountains, sometimes they don't come back. Thanks for joining me today as I'm going to try and tackle some of these questions with you. In early August 1993, 7 hikers from Petropavl, Kazakhstan embarked on an expedition in the Khamar-Daban mountain range of Siberia. They were led by 41-year-old Lyudmila Korovina, an experienced instructor and a master of sports and hiking. The group aimed to traverse the rugged terrain from the shores of Lake Baikal to the summit of Kangula. The team consisted of 6 of Korovina's students: Alexander Krisin, 23, Tatiana Filipenko, 24, Denis Shvakin at 19, Valentina Utochenko, 17, Victoria Salasova, 16, and last, Timur Bapanov at only 15 years old. They were a close-knit group of friends. All were physically fit and familiar with outdoor challenges. August typically offers temperate and humid conditions, influenced by the proximity to Lake Baikal. Precipitation can reach up to 1,300 millimeters annually, with average temperatures in January around minus 16 to 17 degrees Celsius. During the trek, the weather was stable, and the route was well known among hikers. Equipped for summer expedition, the group carries standard hiking gear, including sturdy boots, weather-appropriate clothing, tents, and provisions suitable for the journey. Their plan was to navigate a diverse terrain, which encompasses dense taiga forests, steep ascents, and river crossings. Unbeknownst to them, another group led by Korovina's daughter was on a different route in the same region. She later recounted an inexplicable sense of unease during their journey, a premonition that something was amiss. This foreboding feeling would soon be tragically validated. As the days progressed, the hiker's journey took a catastrophic turn. It was a normal morning on August 2nd, 1993. It was just like any other on the expedition. The hikers woke up, packed their gear, and prepared for the day's ascent. Their goal was to reach a high-altitude ridge before making camp. The weather was still stable, the air crisp, and the sky clear. Ideal conditions for embarking on a mountain trek. But as they climbed higher, the atmosphere would begin to shift. The air is growing thinner, the temperature is dropping, but nothing super extreme. Yet something felt off. Valentina would later recall a sudden tension in the group, as if an unseen weight had settled over them. They kept moving. No one spoke about it, but maybe they just wanted to all reach the next waypoint. And then, out of nowhere, Denis Shvakin, the strongest in the group, collapses. It wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't altitude sickness, it was something else entirely. His body convulsed violently. He gasped for air, his limbs seizing, his face contorted in pain. Foam bubbled from his mouth, and his eyes. There was blood leaking from his tear ducts. The others rushed to help him, but before they could react, it spread. One by one, the hikers dropped where they stood, their bodies jerked and twisted in agony, their muscles locking up. Their expressions froze in terror. Their lungs choked with foam, their eyes red with ruptured blood vessels. Lyudmila Korovina, their leader, she was still alive. She screamed at them to stay calm as she tried to help Denis, but as she went to go lift him, it was too late, he was already gone. Then she collapsed too. Valentina couldn't do anything but watch. 6 people, all young, strong, and prepared, lying dead right in front of her, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. And she sat in terror, wondering if it was about to happen to her next. This had only taken minutes. Everything had fallen apart so fast that her brain couldn't process it. The sounds of the convulsing body, the gasps, the choking, the blood, and then silence. She was completely and utterly alone. Her mind screamed at her to do something, but her body refused to move. All around her, the silence was deafening. Every rational part of her brain told her to check the bodies, to grab her gear, to think. But the primal part of her took over. She ran, not in careful retreat, not in a planned descent. She ran like a cornered animal, driven purely by instinct. Her feet pounded against a rocky trail, her vision blurred by tears. The trees closed in as she stumbled downhill, her body slamming into low branches, her skin scraped by jagged rocks. She didn't even grab her backpack. She didn't take any food, and she didn't look back, because in her mind, there was something still up there. Something had taken them, and if she stopped, if she hesitated for even a second, it would take her too. By the time her legs finally gave out beneath her, the sun had began to set. The warmth of the day vanished, replaced by a creeping cold of the Siberian night. She had no tent, no sleeping bag, no extra clothes, only the sweat-soaked layers on her back, still damp from panic and exhaustion. All she could do was curl up under the roots of a fallen tree, hugging herself for warmth, listening to the distant howls of the wind. Or at least she told herself it was the wind. But every sound in the darkness made her stomach clench in fear. The rustling of the branches, the snap of twigs, the stillness of the forest. Was she actually alone? I don't know if you've ever spent any time in the woods alone at night, but it certainly is creepy, and there's a psychological effect that magnifies every sound that you hear. You think it's a predator. I don't know if this goes back to ancient times or what, but your nervous system is on edge and your imagination runs absolutely wild. Now, I tried to use my imagination to say this in a more creative way, but really, what I'm hoping is you'll subscribe to the channel if you like the content, you'll share this with someone you know, and if you like what you're hearing, let us know. It tells us whether or not we should make more of this type of content. And I won't keep you longer, so let's move on. Now, by the next morning, Valentina was starving. The last meal that she had eaten was the day before, back at the campsite, when the world still made sense. Here she was. She had no food, no water, and no idea where she was. Now, by the next morning, Valentina was starving. The last meal that she had eaten was the day before, back at the campsite, when the world still made sense. Before her, the mountains stretched endlessly, the valleys below dense with thick Siberian forest. She had two choices: basically stay put until someone would find her, or keep moving and hope she found someone first. Her choice was to walk. Each step was agony. Her muscles were already tight with dehydration. Her stomach gnawed at itself. The sun burned her skin in the open. The cold clotted her in the shade. She stumbled upon a small stream and fell to her knees, scooping up handfuls of icy water, gulping it down like she'd never drink again. She had to keep going, but with every hour that passed, the line between reality and fear blurred. She started hearing things, like footsteps that weren't hers, or shadows shifting through the trees. Her exhausted mind whispered, was something following her? Am I next? Or was she just losing herself in the wild? She would make it through another day when rescuers finally spotted her. Valentina hardly looked human anymore. Her face was hollow. Her lips cracked from days without food or water. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and her body had been weakened to the point of collapse. But it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper. Something that had hollowed her from the inside out. They asked her what had happened. When she opened her mouth to speak, words wouldn't come out. Not just because she was weak, because she truly didn't know how to explain it. And when the rescuers finally reached the site where her friends had died, they understood why. The scene was impossibly strange. The bodies lay scattered across the mountainside, their positions bizarre, as if they had collapsed mid-motion. Some had torn at their own clothes, as if struggling to breathe. Others were frozen in their expression of terror, their limbs twisted unnaturally. There was no wounds or no signs of an attack. No avalanche, no evidence of poisoning, and no clear cause of death. And yet, something had obviously killed them. Their tents remained completely untouched. The group's supplies still neatly packed. It was as if they had been struck down by something invisible, something sudden, and something completely unexplainable. The rescue team couldn't agree what they saw either. The shock of the scene must have been something else. Some would go on to say that the bodies were frozen in place, while others swore they could see fresh traces of foam still in their mouths. And Valentina? She would never return to that mountain, because whatever had taken them, she felt it was still watching. When investigators eventually arrived at the scene, they expected an answer, a clear cause, some logical conclusion. But as the bodies were examined and subjected to autopsies, every explanation they tried to reach seemed to fall apart. The forensic results were deeply unsettling. The official cause of death was ruled as hypothermia, that Ludmila had suffered a heart attack. And when you get into some of the other findings, you'll see that it starts to make you question whether hypothermia was really what was behind their deaths. Now, what we do know is that there was no external injuries. So there was no signs of an avalanche, no signs of an animal attack or like some kind of mechanism like a rock hitting them. However, there was extreme internal bleeding. Several victims had hemorrhaging in their lungs and other organs as if their bodies had suffered some kind of internal trauma. Definitely not something you see with hypothermia. Foam in the mouth and airways. Now this suggests pulmonary edema, sometimes a symptom of suffocation or poisoning, or altitude sickness. And the fact remains is that where the group was found was nowhere near high enough to actually cause altitude sickness. So that's kind of a really baffling point with this. Also, with that, you have blood seeping from their eyes and ears, which doesn't make, again, a lot of sense with hypothermia. Now, another thing is they were tested for toxins and drugs, and there was no known traces of anything in their system. So it was as if their bodies had just shut down from the inside out all at once in the middle of a clear day. Now, this may sound kind of familiar to a few of you, and that's because this isn't the first time hikers in Russia's remote wilderness died under these types of impossible circumstances. 34 years earlier, in 1959, 9 experienced hikers in the Ural Mountains met a similarly horrific fate in what's now known as the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Their tent was found slashed open from the inside, their bodies scattered across the snow, some with mysterious internal trauma, with no external injuries, while others were missing their eyes and tongues. The types of injuries, as an expert would go on to say, that could only be caused in something like a high-impact collision, like a really bad car accident. Yet none of the people had any visible external injuries on them. The official cause? Hypothermia. But just like in the Dyatlov case, the deaths of the Korovina Group make no sense. There's no avalanche, no external injuries, no signs of a struggle, and absolutely no reason as to why 6 physically fit people dropped dead in the middle of the wilderness at exactly the same time. So what could have happened? Some believe that the group accidentally ingested toxic mushrooms or a toxin in their environment. It could have been in something like tainted water. Now, at first glance, this seems reasonable. Many wild plants and fungi in Siberia can cause severe poisoning, hallucinations, and even death. And in the Dyatlov case, some theorists have also suggested that the group may have accidentally consumed psychoactive plants, triggering confusion and panic. But there's a problem. Why did Valentina survive? If the group had eaten something toxic, she would have too, or she would have at least let the investigators know that. Yet she showed no signs or symptoms of poisoning. Not only does Valentina's account cast doubt on this, there's more questions like why were the deaths so violent? Many plant-based toxins cause more of a slow organ failure, not a sudden, uncontrollable convulsion and bleeding from the eyes. Just food for thought on that. I don't see the mushroom theory really panning out in this one. I actually thought it could be an explanation in the Dyatlov case, but yeah, like there's just so much evidence of something really weird happening here. There doesn't seem to be evidence to support a poison mushroom death. I'm not opposed to the idea that they may have been poisoned. It just seems like most natural toxins don't have this type of effect. And it leads me to think this has maybe linked to something more chemical in nature. And another theory suggests that the group stumbled upon an abandoned Soviet military test site. This theory has also been used to explain what happened at the Dyatlov Pass incident. And the idea is that these remote mountain regions were once used for chemical or biological weapons testing, and that residual agents remained in the soil or air. Now, nerve agents like sarin or Novichok can cause convulsions, foaming at the mouth, and respiratory failure, all symptoms seen in the Korovina Group. But again, here are the problems. There's no evidence of chemical warfares or agents that were found on the hikers during the autopsies. Another question goes on is, why did Valentina not suffer any exposure? And there doesn't seem to be any official records in Russia that the Khamar-Daban region was ever used for weapons testing. However, you do have to take into account how secretive the Soviet government can be. And it wouldn't be the first time people died mysteriously near a classified site in Russia. So it could be possible that if there was an exposure, that the military did try to restrict information. However, again, there's no evidence of it. But another interesting thing that I haven't seen completely talked about in some other accounts of this story, maybe it's because it falls more in my wheelhouse of expertise, but when chemicals or agents like this are released into the natural environment, they just don't last long. So 1993, that's around the time when chemical weapons were actually getting banned. So it's not possible that the government still had access to this or could have kind of been fucking around and testing with it at that time. But it would have had to have been almost immediately in the time frame that the group was there. Meaning, like, it would have had to be somewhat on purpose, or they definitely knew that it was a cause and then covered it up, because chemicals like those found in sarin would typically degrade in exposure to open air. And after about 24 to 48 hours, they would be completely broken down. Even if it's like on surfaces like wood or trees and plants like that, the most it's going to persist in the environment is like a few days. If they were exposed to nerve agent, it certainly was known to somebody, and I can see why probably the government didn't want to tell people about it, because that would be a pretty big no-no in my books. However, again, without the information, it's just speculation, so I don't know. But interestingly enough, it's not the only possible avenue people kind of link the military to this. And another option that's put out on the internet is that they may, through either a military program or a natural event, been exposed to infrasound, which may have been the cause of the group's death. Now, I'm going to explain what this is. So there's two things that can cause infrasound: weapons, and then something called Katabatic wind. Now, Katabatic winds is one of the main theories actually in the Dyatlov Pass case. And the idea is that a sudden, powerful wind rolling down from high altitude peaks can create a low frequency sound known as infrasound. And infrasound is known to cause extreme panic, nausea, disorientation, and even hallucinations. It's possible that the hikers were hit by an intense windstorm, triggering mass panic. Their symptoms of convulsions, foaming, and terror could have been caused by oxygen deprivation or extreme stress. This is a real thing that can happen to animals or people that are put under extreme stress, like your nervous system just goes absolutely haywire. But again, now infrasound is also rumored to be a thing that the militaries have developed. It is a way to use sound essentially to cause psychological effects in people or illness. Now, the more commonly known cases of this are something related to Havana syndrome, which is where diplomats and people in Havana, Cuba were getting sick, experiencing headaches, nausea, and some people thought that maybe the American embassy or the Canadian embassy was being targeted with infrasound weapons. Now, again, it's speculative and there's not a lot of information to support this theory, but there's something that goes against the use of infrasound either as a weapon or naturally occurring to me, is that it would have the exact same effect on every person at the same time. But there's things that infrasound, to me, that just doesn't fit an explanation for this event, just like I don't think it fit the explanations in the Dyatlov Pass. Infrasound affects people differently based on their individual physiology and their mental state. So it's extremely unlikely that all 6 hikers would simultaneously convulse and die when being affected by infrasound. It would likely just affect the entire group differently, maybe having 1 or 2 people panic while other people just report mild symptoms, as per what kind of the studies around infrasound say. So it doesn't really at all kind of offer a definitive explanation as to what happened to this group. And like a lot of things when we can't explain them, people start lending their mind to the paranormal. And some people actually believe that something unnatural is at play. In those mountains, there are reports of unexplained lights in the sky. Some locals believe that hikers angered something in the mountains, while others think that they saw something they just weren't supposed to see and ended up being silenced. Now, there has been stories of people being injured during encounters with things like UFOs or these strange orbs and lights, but usually in those cases, the injuries are described as more like a radiation burn. And there was no radiation present, so it seems again that we're left scratching our heads. And that's exactly what the definitive answer is in this from the officials. There is no official answer. And what happened in 1993 on that ridge is seriously a mystery. The deaths were ruled as hypothermia, but that, and often is like in an autopsy report, that doesn't mean it was like what catalyzed the death. It was just what caused the last little bit of them dying. So there's no explanation as to what caused the bleeding from the eyes, the internal bleeding, the complete loss of oxygen and choking and foaming at the mouth, because there was no toxins. And to this day, Valentina, she has stopped talking about the incident. It was just too traumatic for her. Years later, the mystery of the Korovina Group remains as unsolved as the day the rescuers found their bodies. No new evidence has surfaced to explain exactly what happened on that ridge. Modern investigators have tried to re-examine the case, but every theory leaves these gaps. The Russian wilderness has always been home to unexplained tragedies, and both cases stand out because on the surface, they appear way too violent for natural causes and too sudden for human intervention, too strange to be ignored. And then there's Valentina Utochenko. What really happened in the Khamar-Daban Mountains that day? We don't know. Did they stumble into a military experiment gone wrong? Did an unknown force take hold of them, something beyond science? Or was it simply another case where nature itself was the deadliest force of all and we just can't figure it out? We may never know, but one thing is for certain: some mysteries refuse to stay buried. Thanks again for joining in, and I'll be back again next week. See ya.